Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the modern Erilar. In my last episode, I mentioned that the use of runes continued past the Viking Age, past the medieval period, and in certain areas past 1500 of the Common Era, and that the Swedish rune poem is evidence of that survival of runic usage. So, today, let's discuss runic literacy in the early modern era. In the second half of the 14th century, the vast majority of runic usage gradually ceased within Scandinavia, and very little runic writing occurred after 1500 of the Common Era. That doesn't mean that nobody wrote in runes after 1500, only that we may have insufficient evidence in the source material and uncertain dating applied to that material to conclude that it survived outside of isolated pockets of rune writers. In Norway, for example, no runic writing can be dated with certainty to the 16th century, but from the middle of the 17th century up to the 20th century, about 200 runic inscriptions have survived, some of which you can see on display in the Norsk Folkemuseum. But in Iceland, the rune tradition survived until the 17th century, either written on tombstones, like you can see here, or in manuscripts, which is the majority of what survives. This tombstone is a fairly typical "Here Lies" inscription, with a name, a religious phrase in Latin capitals, along with the date. The runes themselves here haven't evolved much from the medieval usage that I described in my Iceland episode. From the Faeroe Islands, we know of the Fámjin stone. The text has one line of runes and a corresponding line of Roman letters. We assume that this is a tombstone and that the inscription indicates someone's initials, so D for the given name, P indicating the father's name, and the S would tell us that this is someone's son, so Peter's son or Paul's son, and the F stands for Fámjin, the area where the stone was found. A third line is now illegible, but probably indicated the date, which would have been sometime shortly after the Icelandic Reformation in 1538. So we do have late runes in isolated areas, and one of the largest and probably the most famous set of these comes from Dalarna in Sweden, from which at least 350 inscriptions survive, more than 315 of which come from the Älvdalen region alone. Our first record of Dalecarlian runes as a specific rune row comes from Johannes Boreas's 1599 copper plate engraving Rune Kjensenes Leiresbom, where Boreas gives us the graphs of the Dalecarlian runes in a table, alongside runes observed in other regions of Sweden, and also a line from those in Denmark. Only a handful of runic inscriptions survive from Dalarna prior to the early modern period, and several scholars have argued that late medieval and early modern inscriptions here do seem to indicate a continuous tradition. What might this look like? For example, at Gulogården in Våmhus, inside a granary that's been dated to 1495, we have this inscription where the O is represented by a stung or rune, and dotted runes or stung runes are consistent with medieval practice, though in Norway this would have usually been a Y sound. This graph was used for different sounds in different places. So in Sweden, especially 100 kilometers up a river, it makes sense that this took over for a sound that's differentiated from a U, because all of them were differentiated from a U by the presence of the sting or the dot. In this early 16th century inscription, we also see the stung or being used for the O in the word oh. Helmer Gustafsson, Sven-Göran Hollenqvist, and Stefan Friedel have each argued for continuity between earlier inscriptions and these ones, among others. Another point of continuity is the use of the same rune for both voiced and voiceless consonants. So B being the letter that's used for both P and B sounds, and T being used for both D and T sounds, so voiced and voiceless of the same type of consonant. And we would see that the same in Younger Futhark. So this goes back to the Viking Age. A third point of continuity with the medieval period, at least, is the use of the star rune for both H and a fricative G sound. So we see that here, where there's an H and also a fricative sound, indicated by the same rune. Over time, though, we do see evolution away from what we see in the medieval period. The E rune, for example, according to Johannes Boreas, was used, we used the short branch version of the A rune, just extended down to the bottom line, or the short branch version full stop, instead of the long branch version of the A rune, and this would have been instead of a dotted I, which would be more typical for other places within Scandinavia, and Boreas tells us that this is what they do in Dalarna. Dalarna also evolved a unique G rune. It had been this crossed version of a count. Crossing is a natural evolution of the dotting that was common during the medieval period. And so this did persist through early modern use the whole way up to the 19th century. And this is a publication from 1832. It goes the whole way through the early modern period being used in this area. We also see an interesting application of the acrophonic principle, where the first letter of the rune indicates the sound that it makes. So Hogel, the star rune, used to be used for H sounds. So Hogel, H sounds. In Dalarna, this came to be used for the O sound. And this may have been because the H is not a very distinct sound in this dialect. If you're English as a first language, you might think of this in terms of the same kinds of differences between dialects when people say herbs versus herbs, or hello instead of hello. The same principle might apply here, and so this could have been a very natural evolution for the local rune row if the H isn't a very distinct sound. The K rune, kaun, went through several evolutions over time before the Latin version of the letter ultimately took over. Latin letters also over time took the place of the letter C, O, and T. In the 1670s, we also see a shift to Latin capitals, specifically when recording personal names. Prior to 1670, the whole name would have been written out in runes, but after 1670, names were recorded by initials written in Latin capital letters. So here, Marit Lars Dotter is written MLD in Latin capitals, but the rest of the inscription is written in runes. Scholars still disagree about the extent to which any early modern runes represent a continuous literacy on one hand or a runic revival on the other. To contextualize this disagreement, let's summarize some previous episodes on medieval runes here to get a baseline. In the medieval rune row, we see alphabetic rather than Futhark order, so A, B, C rather than F, U, and so on. Whereas in the younger Futhark, the same rune would have been used to represent both the voiced and the voiceless form of the same type of consonant, so G and K, P and B, for example. Dotted runes reintroduced differentiation in the voicing, so one of the runes could have been dotted to distinguish it, and we see that here with the kaun rune dotted to distinguish the G. For other related sounds that previously would have been represented by the same rune graph, the long branch variant becomes the graph for the secondary sound. So, for example, with C and S, the sibilant consonants, the short twig form becomes the primary S sound, and the long branch variant of the soul rune has become the C. In the early 20th century, following, for example, the 1939 work of Anders Beksted, scholars believed that it was difficult to demonstrate an unbroken chain of runic literacy, or runicy, after 1500. Indeed, this may be true in the Norwegian material because of that gap that I mentioned. Scholars like K. Jonas Nordby have pointed out within the last 25 years that post-Reformation runic inscriptions in Norway contain runes that weren't present in the Norwegian medieval runic tradition, but instead, the forms of certain rune graphs corresponded to Futharks printed in books from 1550 onwards. Runes were a scholarly interest at this time, particularly in the books of Johannes and Olaus Magnus, like the 1555 Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus, the Description of the Northern Peoples, or the Danmarkis Regis Krønike, or the Danish Royal Chronicle of 1603 by Harald Huitfeldt. Both of these recorded an alphabeticum Gothicum, or a Gotlandic alphabet. Both of these runic tables use a downward pointing arrow for a C, which is definitely a step away from Norwegian medieval practice. The rune corresponding to E is reasonably close to the medieval dotted I rune that would have been used for E sounds, but the backwards Tors rune that's being used for Q is entirely unique, as is the use of the Ir rune for Z instead of Y, which would be where we would expect this rune to be located. The rune for the short A sound, the Esh symbol that's shown here in Huitfeldt, is perhaps a misinterpretation of the double-sided long branch A that was used for the short A sound in medieval runic inscriptions, especially in light of Magnus's angled branch that he gives in this graph here. But he says that this is a symbol for the word and. While this graph is indeed a logical bind rune of the short front vowel and a T rune, using the same stave to support all of the branches, so the same stave to support all of the various branches, it is true that bind runes were common in medieval runic inscriptions, but this particular bind rune would only have been used to transcribe Latin words, since the word et is the word for and in Latin, and the Danish and Norwegian word for and is og, not et. So we definitely see influence of Latin learning in this particular table. Magnus also gives us this symmetrical version of the Ur rune rather than the asymmetrical version that we see in younger Futhark. And we reprise the three medieval calendar runes Orloger, Tvimaver, and Belgtorn, but here Magnus has them represent the Latin X and Y. In this table, we do have reasonable alternate graphs here. So this N would be consistent with medieval practice, a dotted B and this rune would be consistent with late medieval Norwegian practice, and these close enough to a left to right and a right to left version of the soul rune. So these would then logically be alternate graphs for X and Y. Why would they have used these particular runes for these particular sounds? Well, all of them were introduced after Christianization. So it's just filling in what you need, I suppose. it's a reasonable explanation for how these ended up in this table being used for these letters as these runes. If we compare 3 known rune rows from 18th century Norway to that medieval rune row that I've shown earlier, we can see some notable differences. In terms of runes that do line up with medieval examples, the Voss inscription is actually pretty close to medieval practice. And we see some of that dotted distinction to differentiate the Kaun rune from the dotted Kaun rune. So the k and the g sound, we're reintroducing voicing there. The star rune being used for H makes perfect sense. Dotting the Y here, this or rune to differentiate it from other I sounds. In Norwegian, Y is still sometimes used for I, and English speakers might not be able to hear too much of a differentiation between those two sounds, but it is a variation on the U vowel continuum that we would be trying to communicate here in the language of the time. The main runes of the younger Futhark, like Berkana, Feihu, Mother, Nauð, Ræð, Sol, Tyr, all of these maintain continuity in the early modern inscriptions back to even the Viking Age. In the early modern inscriptions, the long branch Sol remains the primary S rune, and the C matches the runes from the tables in Magnus and Huitfeldt. So those ones aren't the short branch version necessarily, except perhaps in the Voss inscriptions. The P rune from Gudbrandsdalen looks quite unique to us, but it appears in several other early modern runic inscriptions from Uppland. The V rune in Voss is a dotted Feihu rune, which would again align with the medieval practice of dotting the voiced version of a stop. But in Gudbrandsdalen and in Berge, we see this symmetric version of the Ur rune being introduced sometimes to differentiate the V from the U, which would have been basically the same in medieval and Viking Age practice. And the symmetric version of the Ur rune doesn't really exist in the medieval period. So it's entirely possible that rune literate writers in the 18th century could have taken their runes from books, the ones that I've shown you even, just like you or I have had to learn these from books rather than from a living runic tradition. Jan Ragnar Haglund tells us that the rune graphs alone can't prove a continuous runic literacy in Norway, and he points out a case study on the Fyresfjord in Rogaland County in western Norway. He traces a peak runacy for a couple of decades after 1850, influenced by 2 individuals, Hans Knut Sørensen and Knut Johannes Knudsen, who both used the same kind of runic forms shown here in an example from a letter written by Sørensen in 1873. Several area elders, when interviewed in the early 20th century, who had lived in the 1850s, described parallel traditions of literacy in both Latin letters and in runes when they were children. And the children who knew how to write in runes were sometimes teasing those who couldn't read them. Another letter was sent from a Jonas Nødland to this same Hans Knut Sørensen, dated to the 2nd of February 1872. Nødland had lived on the farm next to Sørensen, but immigrated to Ossian, Iowa in the United States. This letter is now lost to us, but we know that a scholar recorded that there had been a note in the margins in runes that read, "Don't let Mongala," which is sort of a Maggie version of a name, "don't let her hear about this." So, now that we know that runes have even immigrated to the United States, let's talk about runic literacy in the Americas in our next episode. Thank you for reading the runes with me, the Modern Erilar.